I call this Exhaustion 101. I don't know how familiar everyone in the room is with just some general exhaustion principles, and hopefully this is not either too elementary or over anybody's head. And there are different situations where this comes up. Professional liability and GL policies can sometimes be a little bit different in how exhaustion is handled. Claims made versus occurrence can be a little bit different, and where there are those differences, we'll to some degree address that. But exhaustion is, when is the excess policy triggered? For an excess policy to be triggered, you've got to have all the underlying insurance exhausted. And probably tens of millions of dollars have been spent, if not more, litigating what is meant by the word exhaustion. And it can be exhausting. But there's a couple very key questions here. One of them is, who has to pay the underlying limit for the excess insurance to be triggered? And we've included some examples here of policy language that Jerry and I have pulled from different sources. Does the underlying insurer have to pay the limit? For example, you've got a $10 million primary limit, a $10 million excess limit. Does the primary insurer itself have to pay that whole $10 million before the excess policy is triggered, or can that $10 million be paid by somebody else? For example, can it be paid by the insured or somebody on the insured's behalf? So it's really important when you're trying to figure out if the excess policy is triggered, you've got to look back at the policy language. Who has to pay the underlying limit to trigger the excess? And depending on the language, it can be several different things. The underlying insurer only, the underlying insurer or the insured, or maybe even somebody else on the insured's behalf. Who has to pay that limit? Bankrupt and insolvent underlying insurers. The policy language also may address this. A lot of excess policies have maintenance clauses that say that you've got to maintain the underlying insurance, and there's different wordings on maintenance clauses as well. A recent case out of the Second Circuit, the Ali versus Federal Insurance Company case, there were several layers of insurance in a tower, and at a couple different points in the tower there was an insolvent insurer. And the question is whether or not the excess insurers had to drop down to fill the gap in coverage created by those insolvent underlying insurers. And the court said that where the policy language requires payment of the underlying insurance, then the excess does not drop down and fill in that gap. So in addition to who has to pay, what has to be paid? Actual payment. A lot of policy language, again, look back at the policy language. Do the underlying insurers or the insured, depending on what the policy language says, have to actually pay? Sometimes it uses the word actual payment. Sometimes it uses the word have paid in legal currency. I'm not quite sure what the difference is between legal and illegal currency, but do you have to pay, what has to be paid? Another question is, does it have to be covered loss? And I see this issue come up a lot with excess insurers, where the primary insurer pays something, exhausts its entire limit, but the excess insurer looks at what the primary insurer was paying and says, well, we don't think that whole payment was for covered loss. And we only attach once covered loss up to the primary limit has been paid. So sometimes that can be a dispute as well if the excess believes that the primary has paid something that's not covered. So that's something you've always got to take into account. If you're the insured or the primary, are you paying something that's considered covered loss, or is the excess going to have some argument that you're overpaying, or that you're paying something that's not covered? And then the other language that you see sometimes is something to the effect of either the underlying insurer or or the insured has been held liable to pay that amount. In other words, maybe that means they didn't actually have to pay it, but they've been held liable to pay it. Jerry was telling me about an example. What was it that said obligated to pay?
It said underlying policies have to be either reduced or exhausted by payment or by admission of the underlying carrier. So it's until the insured or the insured's underlying insurer has paid or admitted its obligation. So what does that mean? If you have the $10 million policy and the underlying policy pays $1 million, but admits it was liable for the other 9, does that mean that the guy on top is triggered? And I think my argument would be yes, otherwise, what's the purpose of having the word admitted in the policy language? And I think from my standpoint, the most important point is the one I made earlier today in a different context. You have all these different policy language examples that Jennifer laid out on that slide a few minutes ago. What are you buying and what are you selling? This is the sort of thing, especially after Qualcomm, where people are, especially this audience, which is, I've been told is very sophisticated, that you understand this issue. So what are you buying and what are you selling? I have one practical example where a client of ours had a policy that said the excess guy dropped down if the insurer or the insured paid the underlying amount. And it turned out that the insurance company was not willing to maintain that language in the subsequent policy year, so the client, our client, the insured, moved on to a different carrier who was willing to sell that kind of coverage, that kind of drop-down. But since the drop-down is such a big issue today, you all have to be aware, before you get into a controversy, as to what it is you're selling if you're an insurance company, or what it is you're buying if you're a policyholder.